Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Max Corman. I'm the Director of Programming at NIF Australia, and I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for this end-of-year briefing. We are appreciative of you all for joining, and also to our colleagues in the US for their analysis and this important discussion at this moment. As Daniel and Yael will share, NIF is deeply committed in responding to this moment and this crisis. Our grantees and our partners on the ground continue to respond with fundamental humanitarian aid and sustained efforts to respond with values of respect, justice, and equality. Your support at this time will go to support projects that respond to this very moment and also lay foundations for a better future. Grantees like the Tzedek Centres, who were here earlier this year in February, have coordinated an incredible project, Guardians of Hope, in mixed cities. They established emergency headquarters in these cities to respond to the threats of escalation and difficult relationships between Jewish and Arab neighbours. In May of 2021, when there was increased violence in Israel-Palestine, at that very moment, there was increased tension in these mixed cities, and this initiative shows the inspiring strength of shared society in responding to this moment, even in times of crisis and horror. Any support of NIF will go to efforts like these. You can head to our website, www.nif.org.au/donate, to make a contribution of any size. Thank you for joining tonight, and thank you to our partners in the US for this briefing.
Started. So welcome to today's webinar. It's great to see so many NIFers from all over the country. Thank you for joining us at this incredibly difficult time. I'm Libby Lenkinski, Vice President for Public Engagement at New Israel Fund. And with me on today's call are our NIF CEO, Daniel Sokatch, and our board member, Yael Sternhell. Before we jump in, I just want to acknowledge you, the NIF community. Since October 7th and the beginning of the war, you have stepped up to support our work in really unprecedented ways. So on behalf of our whole team, thank you for being there always, and especially now. This is also a good chance to extend a warm welcome to the Canadians who are with us today. Welcome. It's great to be together with you as well. This will be our last webinar for 2023. And we're going to hear a report back from Daniel from his recent visit to Israel and learn about what he observed, what NIF is doing to respond to the crisis. And we'll also then have a discussion with Yael and Daniel about what comes next. And then we'll also do a Q&A. So at any point during the conversation, if you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be looking for those questions. And I don't normally do this on a call that's so much in the family, but part of what has happened over the last 2 months or so, as Daniel keeps telling us, if there's any silver lining to this situation, it's both how our existing community at NIF has shown up and stepped up in Israel and around the world, but also there are really a ton of new people. I think that our numbers show that in November, we had 4 times the number of new donors to New Israel Fund than our highest November in history before that. So there are a lot of new people, and also on this call, who have discovered NIF and supported our work for the first time. So I'm going to actually read Daniel's bio and Yael's bio because there may be people who are new. And so Daniel Sokatch has been the CEO of New Israel Fund for the past 14 years. Before joining, Daniel served as executive director of the Jewish Community Federation in the San Francisco area. And before that, He was the founding executive director of the Los Angeles-based Progressive Jewish Alliance, now known as Bend the Arc. He has been named a million times on every 50 under 50, 40 under 40, biggest influencers in the Jewish community from the Forward and every other publication. Daniel has an MA from the Fletcher School at Tufts, a JD from Boston College Law School, and a BA from Brandeis. Yael Sternhell is an NIF board member. She teaches history and American studies at Tel Aviv University, where, among other things, she was Itamar's favorite professor. Her fields of interest include 19th century US history and the history of modern societies at war. She received her PhD from Princeton in 2008 and has since held fellowships from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the Rothschild Foundation, as well as from Yale University and the Huntington Library in California. A former journalist and news anchor for Channel One, she continues to contribute commentary on American affairs to various media outlets. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daniel, who's going to tell us about his recent trip to Israel and the region. I will also say I sound still a little garbled because of my braces. I'm doing my best to enunciate, but that's why I sound a little weird. With that, Daniel.
Thanks, Libby. First of all, Libby, you don't sound all that weird anymore. You don't have to say that anymore. I forgot all about it. It is wonderful to see so many of you today. Over 600 people signed up for this webinar, which I think speaks volumes about the passion and dedication of our New Israel Fund community, both the veterans, the Vatikim, and also the newer members. Welcome to you all. And it speaks, I think, about the critical nature of the moment in which we find ourselves, which, certainly speaking for myself, these are the toughest days I've ever seen in Israel, and for those of us who care so much about this endeavor. And I would argue that these are some of the most critical days in the history of the state of Israel. And we are truly at a set of interlocking crossroads about that will determine what Israel will be and where it will go in the coming years. And I want to say that that's precisely the reason that when Itamar asked me if we could do a year-end webinar like this, I readily agreed. And I also told him that I wanted to invite my dear friend Yael to be my partner in doing this webinar, because Yael and I have had an ongoing conversation about these issues for at least a decade, most recently last week at Santa Caterina, our favorite restaurant in Tel Aviv. And it seemed to me that it would be useful and interesting for us to continue that conversation with all of you. And the fact that Yael is an historian and an expert on societies living in conflict and wartime, and also a scholar of the United States and our troubled history as an Israeli, I think makes her one of the most fascinating interlocutors and guides to the current moment. Because, as I'm sure we'll discuss today, so much of what we're looking at, we're all concerned about what's happening in Israel first and foremost, but as everyone on this call who lives in the United States or Canada or the UK knows, or elsewhere, these events in Israel and in Gaza have reverberations that are impacting our communities where we are. So I think that Yael is a unique resource for us in being able to bridge those countries and cultures. A couple of quick words of introduction, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So as Itamar and Libby said, I'm just back from a quick trip to Israel. Libby is leaving this evening for Israel. We think it's critically important for us to stay deeply in touch with our community and partners on the ground. And for me, that means first and foremost our staff and board and grantees. So I spent the last week really sitting with them, doing a lot of listening, and thinking with them about the work and how we're all responding to that work. And I want to share sort of maybe three main observations, the third of which is a quick review of what we've done. But first, as some of you have heard me say, in order to truly get our heads around what it feels like to be in Israel right now, and we're going to hear a lot more from Yael about that in a moment, it's very important, I think, for us to keep in mind that for many and perhaps most Israelis, and certainly for Israeli society as a whole, it is still October 7th. And what I mean by that is that the ongoing trauma of that day has in no way dissipated at all, right? Every day when in Israel, one wakes up to new stories of horror, whether it is revelations about horrific sexual abuse, whether it is learning that someone who people had hoped had been captive in Gaza was really gone, was really murdered on October 7th, whether it's worrying about the soldiers who are fighting in Gaza right now and falling every day, or whether it is dealing with the trauma of feeling, as one Israeli friend put it to me when I was there last week, that we're in the worst moment in our history and we are being led by a corrupt band of thieves and racists and extremists. All of these things combine to create an atmosphere in Israel that is the saddest and most difficult that I've ever encountered. And one of the things that I found myself speaking to our Israeli colleagues and friends, and indeed my own family in Israel about, was, recognizing and really hearing this sense that it is still an ongoing October 7th in Israel right now, and also reminding folks that outside of Israel it is December 20th. And that the rise of anti-Semitism around the world in the wake of what's happened is a very real thing, and we'll talk about it. But there are plenty of people who are not anti-Semitic or anti-Israel who have, as people do, just moved on because that's how the news cycle is. And whereas many of those people expressed horror in the weeks after October 7th, now those people are seeing what's happening in Gaza and feeling horror as well. And so Israelis feel, in some ways, I think, understandably and even rightly, that the world looks at Israeli and Jewish pain differently than it does other people's pain. But I think there's also something that isn't accurate about that sensibility. And that is the fact that within Israel, and here's a hard thing to say, but I'll say it in this community, and I say it with love, and I say it with, I know, the support of my Israeli colleague Yael on the phone, on the Zoom with us. There are many people in Israel right now can discuss in great detail and with real significant insight the testimony of the 3 university presidents a few weeks ago in the US Congress. They can tell you what was said and what was not said and how they felt about it, but those people couldn't tell you very much at all about the up to 18,000 people who have died a few kilometers away in Gaza as a result of Israel's attacks on Gaza after the monstrous terrorist attacks of October 7th. Now, I say this not as a judgment about what's happening in Gaza, but as a statement of what I observed in Israel, which is there is incredible connection to what's happening in Israel. As I said, it's still October 7th. There is deep concern and sometimes perhaps even exaggerated concern based on what Israelis hear from the media and from their government about what's happening outside of Israel in terms of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. But there is very little discussion in most quarters of what's happening in Gaza right now. It's not covered in any significant way on the TV news in Israel. Haaretz covers it, but many other news sources cover it very minimally, and the government doesn't talk about it. So this is a very, I'm trying to describe and give you a sense of a strange feel in Israel right now, where even many of our folks in our community have found themselves so traumatized and horrified by the events of October 7th and the ongoing trauma of it, that I think it is a real challenge and a struggle for many Israelis to understand how it is the world is perceiving the conflict 2.5 months later. So I combined observations 1 and 2 in that first observation. So now let me move on and say a quick word about NIF and our response. I'll echo what Libby said a moment ago, and you'll hear more from all of us about it in this hour together. But the way that our community around the world, including in Israel, the NIF community has stepped up in not just the last 2.5 months, but this whole last year of crisis, starting with the attack on Israeli democracy and the judicial coup, as the Israeli newspapers describe it, and NIF's central and critical role in helping to lead the democratic pushback. And now our response to October 7th, our global NIF community has stepped up in ways that are truly awe-inspiring to me. And when I was in the office last week, one of our young staffers who works with the families of the hostages whom we've been supporting said to me that everywhere she goes, and she said two things that I think give a cause for hope. She said, first, everywhere she goes in Israel, people say thank you to the New Israel Fund, which I think should make us all feel good. And the second thing she said was, she hears increasingly throughout Israel in the conversations she's observing and having, even with people who are so horribly afflicted and affected by the events of October 7th. She hears increasingly people beginning to consider what's happening, what Israel's responsibilities are in terms of the war in Gaza. So even though that conversation, as I said, is something that is not happening everywhere right now, Brit on our staff in Israel, whose job is to be out there in the shetach, in the field, tells me that slowly that conversation is beginning to happen in more and more spaces in Israel, and that's something that I'm glad to hear. The NIF response to October 7th, as many of you know, was several-fold, and it included ultimately 4 areas where we went out to raise additional funds. And because of you all, we were very successful in doing so. And that's why people all over Israel say thank you to the New Israel Fund. We raised these funds to augment our standard work, the work that you all know and love and support NIF for, to augment it in 4 areas, 3 of which are quite related to that ongoing work of New Israel Fund. And the first of which was something different. And that something different was not totally novel. There is precedent for it. For example, in the Second Lebanon War, before my time at NIF, but we also responded with what I'll call humanitarian relief. Right, one of the shocks of October 7th was obviously the unpreparedness that Israelis and Israel found themselves in, the state of unpreparedness when Hamas attacked on October 7th, and Israelis overwhelmingly, in my opinion, quite correctly, while they blame Hamas for the attack, they attribute blame for the state of unpreparedness correctly at the feet of the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And they're well aware that that government had a set of priorities, pouring resources into the settlements with a hope to annex them one day, pouring resources into the ultra-Orthodox community, pouring resources into a divisive, ultimately catastrophic attempt to change Israeli democracy into something that looks more like Orban's Hungary or even Putin's Russia, rather than doing their job and protecting Israel. And despite the warnings from the defense minister to the heads of the intelligence and military services, the government focused on its judicial coup. And of course, Israel and the country was unprepared for what happened. There were intelligence failures, security failures, military failures. We're well aware of those. But there was also a failure in the initial weeks after the attacks in providing relief and support for communities that had been afflicted. And into that vacuum stepped Israeli civil society, the same people who had been out on the streets in their hundreds of thousands to protest the attack on democracy, shifted gears to support their fellow country people in the south of the country who were suffering unimaginably and who were not receiving the support they needed from the government in those early days. And NIF was first and foremost a part of that civil society response. And so for the last few months, we have worked to provide shelter and housing and medical care and therapy, counseling for people who have been traumatized by the events of the 7th. And I think most of you know that 2 of the hardest hit communities in Israel were NIF heartland communities. The kibbutzim in the Gaza pocket, as it's known, the English translation from Hebrew, are kibbutzim, many of which were started by Hashomer Tzair, the left-wing socialist Zionist movement. They were and are full of NIF-y people, and I mean that figuratively and literally. Former staff people, grantees, board members, family of board members, all live in those kibbutzim. And so it was very much our community that was hit so terribly. And the second community that received a huge brunt of this attack were the unrecognized Bedouin villages. These are Bedouin communities. Well over 150,000 Bedouin live in these communities in the Western Negev that are not recognized by Israel's government. They're nomadic peoples. They don't want to be settled in big cities. So this conflict continues in Israel. And guess what? Hamas rockets do not discriminate between Jew and Arab, and the terrorists, when they broke through the border, slaughtered Bedouin when they came across them, as well as Jewish citizens of Israel. So we have provided support for Bedouin kids to be able to continue learning as they've been evacuated to the western Negev by getting them iPads so that they can learn. We provided medical care to evacuees in Eilat and trauma counseling. And we've bought literally hundreds of hotel rooms in the early days to shelter people. So this kind of humanitarian relief is not normally the mission of the New Israel Fund, but it is something we engaged in. It is now something that we are ratcheting down as the mighty response of the Jewish philanthropic world outside of Israel finally kicked into gear. We're able to pull back from some of the stuff that we were the first responders to in the early weeks, including, by the way, we are continuing our support of the Hostages and the Missing Families Forum. We've given about $250,000 over the course of the last few weeks to support the efforts of people with loved ones held captive to raise awareness of their plight and to bring them home. We are supporting those demonstrations that you are reading about and seeing on the news in Tel Aviv, calling for the release of the hostages and demanding that the government do more to bring them home. We gave over the course of the last couple of weeks, grants in the six figures to something called the Tzedek Centers, which are care centers run by Hashomer Tzair, this old. We have some shmutznikim on this call right now, as they call themselves. These people who founded these kibbutzim, who forged the labor Zionist ethos back in the day, have now set up centers providing humanitarian support to families and communities who've been displaced and relocated from southern Israel and the Gaza border towns, both Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel. So these are things that we have done that are really humanitarian relief efforts, and many, many more. But the other three areas that we've been responding in are very much part of the NIF heartland, and I'll quickly tell you what they are, and then we'll open up our conversation. First of all, we've been working to ensure that tensions in Arab-Jewish mixed cities and neighborhoods of Israel do not repeat the violence, do not lead to a repeat in the violence that we saw in May 2021, when intercommunal mobs fought each other after the last round of fighting between the IDF and Hamas in Gaza and in Israel, when the specter of an intercommunal collapse in Israel haunted so many of us. Well, thanks to these efforts, pouring resources into the organizations like Standing Together, Omdim B'Yachad, to strengthen Arab-Jewish solidarity, and groups like Have You Seen the Horizon Lately, which is led by Galanter Prize winner Shir Natsatsky. I see the Galanters on this call. Their efforts, along with Kadaya, an Arab-Israeli organization that are working to build and strengthen relationships between Jewish and Arab Israelis, have helped contribute to a situation where we have not, touch wood, seen a return to that horrific violence. Finally, penultimately, we are working to support human and civil rights organizations who are working in the fog of war to monitor and shine a light on what's going on in the occupied territories and in Israel proper, where dissent has become almost criminal and where settlers have used violence to push Palestinians out of their homes. NIF is supporting we're sending extra support to those organizations who are doing the least popular work in Israel right now, which is speaking out about these violations. And then finally, we're putting a lot of support into what we call the day after, and we can talk about that in a bit. But we're funding efforts to understand, to support brilliant Israelis, Arab and Jewish, who are working to build horizons of hope for the region and new paradigms that can ultimately inform future moderate governments and give regular Israelis and Palestinians a reason to hope for a different kind of future. So we can talk more about those efforts now, but let me stop and hand it back to you, Libby, so we can bring Yael in.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm still sort of smiling by your invocation of the word shmutznikim as a shmutznik myself, a Hashomer person. I want to move it over to Yael and welcome you by actually asking, just to start us off, as a historian and a journalist and a media personality, what do you think will happen going forward in Israel from now? And I also want to bring in David's question from the Q&A about, we're seeing a lot of reporting here about Israeli society moving sharply to the right, including some moderates. And David's wondering, and actually so am I, whether you think this is like a permanent change or a trauma reaction. Like in a few months, will those Israelis go back moderate? Or, what do you think about all of that? And in general, where we're going?
Well, as I wrote, David, I really wish I knew. It's always somewhat ironic that as a historian, I'm supposed to also be capable of predicting the future. But look, earlier this year and for many months, public sentiment was shifting left. And there were many, many encouraging signs that people were making the connection between the judicial overhaul and this government's policy in the occupied territories. There was just a kind of a new and extremely invigorated preoccupation with questions of democracy and rights and citizenship. And it seemed like we were entering a new era in Israeli politics. And then came October 7th, and it turned out that we were entering a different era in Israeli politics, but not the one we thought we would be able to operate in. And so, the one thing I do know about history is that it is always surprising, always unexpected, always malleable, fluid. And I think a lot depends on whether the center left in Israel will be able to coalesce around an effective leader and an effective party. Clearly, party realignments are going to shift. But generally speaking, people are on the one hand in their day-to-day conversations are terrified of Palestinians, sometimes accuse all Palestinians of what happened to us on October 7th, et cetera, et cetera. But when asked when they're asked whom they're going to vote for, their answer is center or center-left parties. And so I think Israelis are confused and not sure what to think after what has seemed like our world breaking down. And I think that if the center left is capable of offering effective leadership, and if the US supports effective policies that can guarantee both security but also a way forward, there could be a lot of enthusiasm around that. The kind of the large scale and enthusiastic support of the army and the war and all that, those things never really last in Israel for too long. It's lasted longer than I thought it would, but it's not going to last forever. And as soon as it turns out that the war in Gaza isn't going so great and that the government is unable to deliver on its promises and that it really has no vision to offer, then there will be an opening for new ideas and new people. And if we can harness those energies, then I think there's a real moment here. Look, I mean, I studied the Civil War, the long Civil War era, and it was a terrible war with 750,000 dead and numerous others crippled and ill and traumatized. But it was a turning point in the history of the United States. And it did create a path forward, which had seemed entirely impossible a year or two before it broke out. Now, I'm not thinking as a historian means that you don't draw direct parallels. You never, you don't say, oh, this is like that. History is going to repeat itself. History never does repeat itself. But these harrowing events in the history of at least the Western world, which I know, I won't pretend to speak globally, have often created opportunities for positive change. And I think we're at a moment like this now in which there is an opening here. I don't know whether Israel will be able to take it. I don't know if the Israeli public will rise to the occasion, but I know that the opportunity does exist.
Yael, thank you for that. Is that also like your hope? I mean, I'm sort of reminded, I went to a book talk of Masha Gessen's, the Jewish intellectual who just won the Hannah Arendt Political Thinking Award in Germany. I went to a book talk with them some years ago after Trump was elected, and somebody asked Masha, "What gives you hope?" Masha paused with a very dry Russian sense of humor, said, "Well, the way I see it, Trump is older than Putin, and Putin is older than me." And I guess I'm wondering if what you just said about the possibility of this like horrible crisis and instability, opening up the possibility for positive change, what in your most like fantastical thinking could that look like? What kind of leader could emerge? What kinds of things could happen that would be the evidence of us harnessing
Well,
the movement?
Libby, before I answer that, I actually want to bring you to the kind of the day-to-day, the mundane realities of what it's like to be a Tel Avivian and a history professor and an Israeli Jew and a mother right now. And I want to say that by far, the thing that gives me most hope is my relationships with Palestinian Israelis. And the fact that these alliances have really held firm. And, when I'm down, and, sometimes I am really down, then the person that I write is my fellow NIF board member, Nasrin Khajihia, who is, I think a real hero for many of us, a 40-year-old Palestinian Israeli woman who can, she really needs to run for office. She won't, but she's just the kind of, she embodies every hope and all the potential of Palestinian Israeli and Palestinian life more generally. And, and I write her, and Nasrin, what's going to be the end with us? And she's like, no, and we're not giving up, and we're fighting for our homeland. And, come to Taibeh, spend the day with me, you'll feel better. And, there's a real sense that we are there for each other. And I want to say that the work we're doing on campus right now, Tel Aviv University, I don't mean to make this a fundraising event for Tel Aviv, but the level of effort and intent and resources, just sheer resources, we're investing now in welcoming our Palestinian Israeli students to campus, making sure that they feel safe, that they feel welcome, that tensions are kept under control rather than be allowed to explode in the classroom, in the hallway, in the security checkpoints at the entrances to campus. There's a real sense that we can do this, and 18% of Tel Aviv University students are Palestinian. And I spent hours today in a meeting with Palestinian and Jewish faculty members, hashing out the various details of the plans we're working on. And there's a real sense of camaraderie that we're in this together. And of course, the Jewish faculty members on this committee are the ones who are, they were selected because they're known to have a lot of goodwill and a lot of interest in shared society. But just the sense that we are all in this together, that we are occupying this sane and healthy middle that rejects crass Israeli nationalism and rejects Hamas violence and thinks that we can find a way forward. I'm not saying it's always easy, and clearly there are things that Palestinian Israeli members don't say, and I can never pretend to speak in their name. And there are other Jewish faculty members who are still seething with anger over October 8th and just kind of can't get through it, and try to think what's ahead. But there are real spaces of alliance and friendship and a sense of, everyone's gone insane except us, we're exactly the same. we believe in the exact same things we believed in before October 7th. And we don't understand why everyone around us, either in Israel or the US, has lost their minds. And that gives me hope, the kind of just those day-to-day interactions, that shared work. Fantasies, what I would like to see at the end of the war is the US with any money it can bring into this, I'll just say it, including Saudi money, and the EU, and any sane political power on the face of the earth come in and enforce some kind of humanitarian aid and for Gazans, and God knows the Gazans are suffering, and the Israeli media doesn't show it. I have subscriptions to basically every single important America media platform, so I do see it, and it's just harrowing. I mean, the price that these people are paying for what their leaders have done this can't go on. And so afterwards, we need to rebuild Gaza, and we need strong international intervention. There are two governments here which are the worst that we could have asked for on both sides, and we need the international community to step in and get this place out of control. And most Israelis don't support Netanyahu, most Gazans don't support Hamas, but somehow these are the people that we're stuck with, and this is the moment for the international community to come in and help us out. Now, there are good people in politics. There are a lot of good people outside of politics. I think that I think we need two parties. I think we need a center-left party, and we need a strong Jewish Arab party that will bring together elements of Meretz, that will bring together elements from the joint list, that will bring refugees from the now practically defunct Labor Party, and start over with a new mission and a new vision. We need two alternatives, but not more than two. And between the center and Arab nationalism or Palestinian nationalism, and we need these parties to cater to two different constituencies, and I think that's our mission, and that should be the goal.
I'll just say you made me think. There was an article that I'm sure many of you on the call saw yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, in the New York Times, and it was an article about how sort of Israelis are fleeing the political left in the wake of October 7th. And I am not a New York Times basher. I tend to think that the New York Times gets it right more often than they don't. I know that's a popular hobby for many of us, but I did think to myself when I read that, come on. First of all, people fled the Israeli left long ago. In the election that led to the current government, Meretz, the traditional left-wing Zionist party, did not cross the threshold and got 0 seats. And the mighty Labor Party that built this country, built that country, got 4 seats, the minimum. And their chair just resigned as chair. So this story was reporting something that was true maybe 5 years ago when people were fleeing the left, but it's certainly not true now. And what was particularly ironic, and to your point, Yael, Channel 12 did a set of polls that came out also, or at least I saw them yesterday, same day that the New York Times article came out. And in those polls, a joint Labor Meretz ticket under the leadership of one of these people who is sort of newly burnished because of his heroics during October 7th, a guy called Yair Golan, a former deputy chief of staff of the IDF and a former Meretz legislator. It shows that new left-wing party would get 9 seats, right, in the Knesset. So it is interesting that there's the perception that we have, which is, at least on this side of the ocean, enhanced by reportage like the inaccurate reporting of the Times, which is actually not represented by how Israelis are feeling when they go to the polls, when they answer polls.
No, I mean, I'm an avid New York Times reader too, but you know, the New York Times has a lot to answer for. They've neglected this conflict for years, and now they're coming back with reporting that doesn't really quite get it. I often find their reporting from Israel very shallow and just uninformed by just more sophisticated thinking that is honestly readily available here. So.
I want to jump in here and go to, as a New York Times Wordle doer primarily, I want to ask you, Daniel, about, there's a few questions in the chat, and we sort of touched on the dynamic in the U.S. In terms of U.S. politics, in terms of the American Jewish community, and the media. But, we have Monica, my fellow Schmutznikit, who's asking about how do you deal with the parts of the sort of center left in America who really think that the military actions are going to defang Hamas when we actually have like no reason to think that that's working for the goal of getting Hamas out. Like, is this whole military operation actually going to achieve its goal? And people feel very convinced against the ceasefire. And so Monica's asking, like, what do we do about that? And then there are also questions about an increasingly hostile environment in the American so-called left and the American Jewish so-called left. I say so-called because I no longer perceive some of that as left. But, that are increasingly hostile towards shared society, towards Arab-Jewish partnership of any kind. And like Yael was talking about, we sometimes talk about ourselves as like a bubble of sanity in an insane polarization happening here. And so I think it would be good to hear you comment about that dynamic, especially with Yael's passionate belief that the international community needs to get involved. Like, how could we get there in terms of America?
Well, just a couple of quick thoughts about what you've asked. One is, I'm not a military expert, so I can't judge. And by the way, as we all know, friends, nor are any of the people on social media telling us that the war will succeed, the war won't succeed. Virtually none of them know what they're talking about. The difference is I'm just telling you, I don't really know what I'm talking about. So I can't make an assessment about the sort of military efficacy question. What I can say is that, where I am trained is in international humanitarian law and in the rules of war. And after World War II, a set of structures were put in place by the international community to try to prevent the repeat of the things that had happened in World War II. And they didn't only mean the things that the Axis powers did. They also meant some of the reactions of the Allies, right? And so one of the concepts that was put forward was the notion of what's called proportionality. And this is a linchpin notion in international, in the laws of war, in international law, which of course is a constructive theory anyway. It exists because we all agree that it should exist. But the idea is that in a just war, and let's assume for a second that the response to October 7th would fall under just war, even though I think a lot of us could say, well, the roots of what happened, Yael suggested as much when she talked about the Times lack of coverage. We all know the roots are complicated and they go back, and there's a lot of blame to go around. But in the aftermath of October 7th, let's assume Israel was in a just war position, and it had an obligation, not just a right, but an obligation to protect its citizens from the rapacious horrors of Hamas, which, by the way, Hamas leadership has said we'll do again and again if we get the opportunity. Well, the idea of proportionality stands for the notion that a strategic gain, a military gain, an advantage in a just war situation must be proportional to the amount of suffering that is inflicted upon civilians. So, one of the classic examples is if you have Osama bin Laden in an apartment building, but there's 5,000 people in the apartment building, do you bring the apartment building down? So I think that, as Yael sort of suggested in her comments earlier, if if we think that the numbers that the Gaza Health Ministry is putting forward are even remotely close to correct, right? If we think we're approaching 20,000 mostly civilian casualties, what we can see is the destruction of Gaza. The fact that 1.8 million people have been displaced and are homeless, and countless injured, in a situation where the IDF has yet to establish control over Gaza, where Hamas is still firing rockets, where its leadership is still doing what they're doing, where hostages are still hostages, where IDF is in a position where it's shot dead 3 hostages the other day. In other words, there don't seem to be the kinds of clear strategic victories that would justify the level of civilian casualties. So I guess, that what I have to say there is that Israel is responsible for, and we hear this in what the Biden administration is increasingly saying, and the UK and Germany, right? Israel's 3 closest allies in the world. President Biden is not indiscriminate when he chooses language. I know he sometimes does speak before he thinks. That's his reputation. But when he said that Israel was engaging in indiscriminate bombing last Friday, that was a strong signal to the Israelis that the US and the allies, Israel's greatest supporters, do not think that Israel's pursuit of the war right now is commensurate with the goals it can expect and the casualties it's inflicting. So I think that, like, this is a tough moving target. I shouldn't use that metaphor, but this is a terrible situation where it's increasingly apparent to many people in the world that something about Israel's approach has to change. In terms of ceasefire, it's funny, but not funny, but it's odd the way that term has become sort of, it's now like a triggering phrase that has been sort of co-opted by certain players in the discourse about this on this side of the ocean. So it's for many people, it symbolizes a position about Israel and Hamas that doesn't necessarily reflect only the desire that people stop shooting and that the war stop. So what I'll say about that is the only point in time over the last 2.5 months where hostages have been released and where Gazans have received the kind of aid that they so desperately need, and where the families, huddled in terror in apartment blocks in Gaza and also in communities in Israel, the only period where they've had a respite from the horror of the last 2.5 months has been during the, not quite 1 week ceasefire, or let's call it humanitarian pause. So whatever you want to call that, especially given what Yael said so powerfully earlier, what I said about proportionality, whatever you want to call that, it seems like we desperately need to return to that state of affairs. And then when it comes to the so-called left, as you put it, and I totally agree, look, there have been a lot of, you and I both did a lot of interviews in the first few weeks of the war. The New York Times was interested in that. I remember speaking to the Times, to Time Magazine, to NPR. Everyone wanted to know about this. And I guess what I have to say about that is that, there are several things going on here, I think. One of them is that legitimately the Palestinian narrative about what's happened over the last half a century plus has finally broken through in a way that it never broke through before, when the narrative in this country was really dominated by Israel and pro-Israel forces. And it's uncomfortable for a lot of people to really confront the suffering and situation of Palestinians, not just over the last 2.5 months, but in terms of the occupation in the West Bank over the last 56 years. Second, it is a cause célèbre on campuses. I have 2 daughters on a college campus, and I've we all have side hustles at NIF, Libby calls them. We don't get paid for the side hustles, so they're not really side hustles. Libby's is that she does her Israel therapy sessions, a great podcast with the Forward newspaper. Mine is that I speak with university presidents around the country who are trying to navigate these treacherous waters and speak on campuses, and I try to be as available as I can to students and to faculty who want to try to find a way out of the kind of sloganeering and vituperativeness that characterizes the discourse. Many of you know I wrote a book during COVID trying to do exactly this, to provide an alternate way to wrestle with and deal with these issues. So all I can say there is that, you've got a mix of a lot of things. You've got people paying attention to what's happening in a different way. You've got people virtue signaling on campus. This becomes the cause célèbre on campuses. Many of you must have seen the story the other day. They took a poll of people chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And they asked what river and what sea, and 60% couldn't answer either of those questions. So I don't think there's a lot of deep understanding when it comes to this stuff. And then there's, of course, the really horrific response in what I'll call this sort of neo-Stalinist left, right? Where people seem to dismiss the humanity of Jews and Israelis in a way that they wouldn't to anybody else. And I think that was the shock that many of us experienced. We never thought that these people liked or cared much about Israel, but we thought they were human rights people. That just as NIF has always called out violations of human rights when Israel commits them, when our human rights organizations say Israel has done X, Y, and Z, we support those groups in doing so. I think we naively expected that some of the people in some corners of the racial social justice movement on this side of the ocean and elsewhere would similarly call out horrific abuses when the victims were Jews and Israelis, and they did not. And these are not human rights people. These are not people concerned with humanitarianism, and I think we should call them out on it. Just as we should protect those people who for the first time are able to argue what's happened to Palestinians is something the world must pay attention to, and arguing that Palestinians deserve equality and fairness and a right to live in a just future is not anti-Semitism. It's not even anti-Israel, and we should defend people's rights to say those things. We have to call out on the other side of the coin those people who are speaking out and acting because of animus towards Israel or towards the Jewish people, i.e. anti-Semitism. And so it's a very complex situation. And what can we do? I'll echo Yael's comment about what they do in Israel. We have to be true to our own moral north, and as hard as it is, we have to call out those things when we see them and defend the right of legitimate protesters to protest.
If I can just interject with a quick comment relating to one of the questions in the chat about the American left being increasingly hostile towards Jewish existence in between the river and the sea. Look, I think that there's a way in which the calls to kind of turn back time on Zionism are just simply, divorced from reality. We need to deal in reality. And the reality is that there are 15 million people between the river and the sea, and they need to find a way to live with one another. And I know that for many Americans, and I've written about this as early as in 2011. For many Americans, the framework, the kind of intellectual and ethical framework for thinking about this question is U.S. race relations, right? Whites and blacks. And I study the U.S. South. I wrote a book about the Confederate South. This is what I'm trained in. This is what I teach to mixed Jewish and Arab classes. That analogy works in many ways, but it doesn't mean that the solution can be the same, because Jews and Palestinians between the river and the sea are actually two deeply nationalistic peoples. And I am not in any way principally, ethically, morally against, the one state solution and just one person, one vote, and just, let's work it out. The only reason that I still think a two-state or a Confederate solution is the only real way forward is because this is what most people want. And because two parties that have been fighting each other for 100 years need to be allowed time to heal and to coexist with Palestinian Israelis as, again, a crucial moderating force, a 2 million people public that knows both sides extremely well and understands the complexity and the difficulties that both sides are contending with. And if after 50 years of this, the situation here is ripe for a one-state solution, that would be great. That would be a huge victory for Zionism to be able to truly integrate into this region. And so I honestly do feel that the people who should be making decisions about the future in Israel-Palestine are the ones living here, and that there's something just deeply wrong about these calls to deny coexistence, efforts of coexistence, because they seem unfair. And because the grandfathers and grandmothers of the Jews living here migrated from Europe, well, so did the grandmothers and grandfathers of white Americans. They also came from Europe, and they also took someone else's land. And these are, the world is a terrible place, and I want to move on from. We have to think about historical claims, and we have to deal with historical memory. We have to acknowledge everything that has happened here. Israel has to apologize. Israel has to pay reparations. Israel has to do a million things. But at the end of the day, Israel also has to sort of just to move on and think about the future, and to deal in what is possible rather than in some post-colonial fantasy of kind of emanating out of college campuses. And I am a creature of college campuses, both Americans and Israeli, and I'm going to spend next year on an American college campus. This is very much who I am, but I still think that there is post-colonial theory, and there is reality on the ground for 15 million people.
Thank you, Yael. Get ready to be lectured to from kids about Frantz Fanon. I'm just warning, early warning, that's what will happen when you arrive. I see the time, and I wanna move it back to Daniel to talk a little bit more about where NIF is going in this moment. And I will also say, to your point about it being real life, that Daniel said that for many Israelis, it's still October 7th. And for many of us also here who lost people, either close people from our families and friend circles, or are carrying that feeling of loss, it sometimes feels like that too. And so while we're talking analytically and thinking about the future, many of us are still carrying grief, like real actual grief. And I wanted to make space for that also here, since our community is so enmeshed with I know there are people on this call who are experiencing that. So I want to move back to you, Daniel, to talk a little bit about NIF in this moment and to close us out.
Thanks, Lib. And I want to give the very last word to Yael. But it's moving to me that you said what you just said, Libby, because what I wanted to share with the community was a letter that you and I, Libby, received from from the first executive of New Israel Fund, who found in his files a letter from our former board member, Vivian Silver. And especially because we have so many Canadians on the call with us, I want to take a moment and say one of the terrible losses for the NIF community and the broader world, of course, and our sector, but for NIF was the murder of Vivian Silver on October 7th, a founder of Ajik, a founder of Women Wage Peace, basically every good thing, a woman who in her spare time would take kids from Gaza to doctor's appointments in Israel, the very essence of the spirit of who we are as a movement and an organization, and was murdered by Hamas terrorists on the 7th. The letter that my predecessor sent Libby and me, because he knew we would want to see it, was a letter from Vivian upon her terming out of the board of the New Israel Fund, about all of the ways in which NIF had been for her the vehicle to finally realize her values and her dreams and her ideals about Israel, and about how for her it was the foundation and font and engine of her activism, and it with characteristic humor and sweetness. She sort of talked about those formative moments for her in terms of her activism and her life's work, which happened here at New Israel Fund, serving on the board the way that Yael and I serve today. And I was really so moved by this letter, because I also feel like it's the answer to your question, right? How does NIF move forward? We move forward by reaffirming our deepest held belief that there is no future that is not a shared future, as Yael just said, for Arabs and Jews in Israel. That Israel, whatever anyone wants to dream or say, Israelis and Palestinians both exist. They're not going anywhere. And the holy work that we're called on to engage in is in trying to build a future where that can happen peacefully, where people can coexist and live their lives and just do what every other person on this planet wants to do, which is to love their families, build meaningful community, and make it home safely at the end of the day. And New Israel Fund's entire work is dedicated towards bringing about that reality. From the work from that enormous amount of our energy that goes into those relationships between Arabs and Jews, about which we've spoken, the enormous amount of energy that goes into supporting those organizations that are doing that uncomfortable work of shining a light on what Israel is doing, both within Israel proper and in the occupied territories, that move it further away from liberal democracy and that kind of shared future. And in the extraordinary work that NIF does every day in ensuring that marginalized and minority communities have their voice and have the tools to advocate for a better future. So look, what I want to do is to thank you all. You began, Libby, by noting what an extraordinarily, if you quoted me, right? If there is a silver lining, if there is a bright spot, it's been all of you stepping up. We have raised millions and millions of dollars above and beyond what we planned on doing this year to support that emergency response. And you all are the reasons we did it. So I just want to thank you. And for those of you who have not yet had an opportunity to do it, there's still time. You've got 11 more days in December. So please do go online and make your contribution to this extraordinary work, which, people in my job often say to webinars like this, now more than ever. But I think we all understand that we are at the now more than ever moment in the great project of the New Israel Fund to try to realize the founding values of the State of Israel. So I want to thank everybody for that. And I'd love to hand it over to you, Yael, for a last word of goodbye.
So just one word of goodbye. I mean, I've been getting some questions that I'm trying to answer live on the chat. When I was referring to some kind of far utopian future in which nationalism won't matter anymore, and in which we could all just live here and sort of define ourselves differently. That really is a very far and utopian future, which I'd like to think may be possible for the whole world. But at the moment, I remain a strong supporter of the two-state solution, and as an Israeli who actually lives here, I would like to maintain everything that Israel has achieved and allow it to grow and become the kind of country that I will be proud of and that my children can be safe in. These are very real concerns for those of us here on the ground, and I am deeply committed to a solution that will allow both, will allow this country to thrive and provide safety for Jews, but also be the kind of country that lives up to Jewish values and that can make us all proud. And on that note, I just wanted to thank all of you for caring about us. There's so many worthy causes in America to support. I know that resources are not unlimited, and the fact that you choose to support our work, to support this extremely precious world of Jewish and Palestinian shared activism, the support of a liberal Jewish democracy where everyone feels equal and free. I'm just deeply grateful for this, your commitment, and for the fact that you care, honestly. I'm always moved by it. I always tell Daniel that I never take it for granted, that he's at the helm of this huge operation called the New Israel Fund, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you. I don't think I have the proper words to describe how much it means to us, especially now especially as things are so difficult, to have a community of supporters in the United States and elsewhere in the world, in Australia, in Canada, in Germany, to have a community that is with us in this very difficult middle ground between crass Israeli nationalism and crass Palestinian nationalism. And I am deeply grateful to each and every one of you for sustaining us and supporting us, for standing in solidarity with us. It's always important, but now more than ever.
Thank you very much, Yael and Daniel. And as I mentioned earlier in the call, we'll be back with more webinars and briefings in the new year. Until then, happy holidays to those celebrating. Stay healthy, stay strong out there, and have a happy new year.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy New Year.